Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Sukkah Daf Nun Aleph contains one Mishnah, which divides the Daf in half. From the beginning of the Daf until the Mishnah is discussing a number of old machloksin, which we've seen. One is about the musical instruments that the Levium played in the Beis Hamikdash. Was that part of the avoda? Did that count as avoda? The Gemara will revisit that machloksin and we'll try to show that's the machlokis Tanaim, and then reject that it's not a machlokis Tanaim. Then the Gemara will go back to an old machlokis Amoraim, interpreting a machlokis Tanaim, as to whether or not you're allowed to play musical instruments in the Beis Hamikdash on Shabbos and on Yontif. The Gemara's machlokis Amoraim is about where precisely that machlokis Tanaim is. The Gemara will decisively decide that discussion and then show a source for the opinion. Then we'll get to the Mishnah, which will describe how Simchas Beis HaShe'eva was performed, and the Gemara following it will describe the city of Alexandria and the Jewish community. They are very famous Gemara about how well apportioned and set up that Kehillah was until it was destroyed, and why it was destroyed and by whom. So let's begin the Gemara. The Gemara is discussing a machlokes as to whether or not the playing of musical instruments in the Beis Hamikdash counts as avoda. We know that the musical instruments were played every time there was nesachim poured on the mizbech with karbanos. Gemara has a question as to whether that's avoda, the instruments is avoda, or only the singing is avoda. What is the main avoda of the Levium's musical accompaniment? Is it the singing or the instruments? And we're specifically focusing on the instruments. Does that count as avoda or not? So the Gemara wants to say it's machlokes Tanaim. It's a three-way machlokes Tanaim that we see in a brayso. So the Gemara wants to say it's dependent on this. What's a machlokes Tanaim? That machlokes is a brayso in Erchin discussing who held and presumably also played those musical instruments. According to Rabbi Meir, it was the avadim, the slaves of the Kohanim. According to Rabbi Yossi, it was Yisraelim, not Kohanim or Levium, and not avadim. They were the families called Pigarim and Tzifraya, and they came from a town called Amum. They were the ones who held the musical instruments in the Azar. And the third opinion is of Chanina ben Atignis, who says that they were Levium. So we have three opinions here: Avadim, Yisraelim, or Levium. So the Gemara says probably the machlokes is about whether the playing of the musical instruments counts as avoda or not. If it counts as avoda, it has to be done by Levium. If it is not avoda, it can be done by anybody, even avadim, and that explains why the avadim of the Kohanim were able to do it. So the Gemara says that can't be the pshat, because then how would you understand the middle opinion of Rabbi Yossi? Why would he say that it has to be Yisraelim? If he held that it could be anyone because it's not avoda, if he held that it's not avoda, then he should say it could be avadim. And if he held that it is avoda, it should have to be Levium. Where does his opinion come from? So the Gemara therefore says you have to say that there's a whole different explanation here, and it has nothing to do with whether it counts as avoda or not. The actual machlokes is just what was the actual events, what actually happened, who were the ones on the platform there holding those musical instruments. Now, why do I need to know that? The Gemara says because you need to be able to research people to know what their status is. And the question is, can you prove from the fact that you have evidence that somebody stood on the platform there and held those instruments, does that tell you something about his heritage, about his yichus? And these are important things to know. You have to know, first of all, is somebody an Eved, because if he's an Eved, then he's not marriageable to a regular Yisraelis. And if he's a Yisrael, you have to know that. You also have to know whether or not he's a Levi, whether or not he can give him Meiser or not. So according to the first opinion, which is Rabbi Meir, you cannot prove anything from the people standing there. They could have been avadim. You can't even marry them. You certainly can't give them meiser. According to Rabbi Yossi, you could marry them because they're definitely not avadim. The fact that they stood there means they weren't avadim, but you can't give them a meiser because they weren't leviim necessarily. And according to Chanina ben Atignis, if they were standing there on the duchen, then they were leviim, and you can give them meiser. You could assume that they were leviim because those were the only people who stood there, and it has nothing to do with our discussion. Okay, now the Gemara goes back to an old machlokes. We've seen a machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda, whether or not the playing of musical instruments in the Beis Hamikdash can be done on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda had said yes, and the Chachamim had said no, not either of them. Now, we have a machlokes Amoraim. What is the case that they are arguing about? What are they arguing about specifically? Which musical instruments? That goes together with karbonos, which is avoda, possibly, or that which goes together with the drawing of the water, the Simchas Beis HaShe'eva, which is just really extra simcha. Far less likely that could push away Shabbos than the avoda. So, according to Rabbi Yosef, which we've seen on the daf yesterday, Rabbi Yosef says that the their only machlokes is about the karbonos. But the Simchas Beis Sheva definitely does not push away Shabbos according to all opinions. You can't do it on Shabbos or on Yantif. The other Gemara brings the opinion of Rabbi Yirmiyah, who says no. The machlokes is in the case of Simchas Beis Sheva. That's a extra simcha. Machlokes if you could play music there on Shabbos or on Yantif. However, with the karbonos, everybody agrees that for sure you can. Okay, so this is the machlokes. Now the Gemara says, if you look in our Mishnah, our most recent Mishnah, you have, first the Gemara brings a Brisa. The Gemara says, if you look in a Brisa, you have a clear proof. The Brisa says specifically that the argument between Rabbi Yosef Yehuda and the Chachamim is about the Simchas Beis Sheva music. So they definitely argue about that case. It clearly goes against Rabbi Yosef, who says that in that case they all agree that you cannot play music. Their only machlokes is about the carbon music. So the Gemara says, okay, so we're certainly rejecting Rav Yosef's opinion as to what is the halacha about playing music as part of Simchas Beis Sheva. He said there's no machlokes, everybody agrees you can't, but here we see a Brisa clearly says there's a machlokes in that case. The question, though, is now, what about the other half of what Rav Yosef said? Rav Yosef said that there is a machlokes about the carbon music, the music that goes along with the karbonos, that there they argue, and the Chachamim would say you cannot play music there, and the and Rabbi Yehuda says that you could. The question is, does this brisa prove that that's false also? That there everybody would agree that you're allowed to play music, because this brisa only said that there is a machlokes in the case in the as far as Simchas Beis Sheva. Can we prove from there conclusively that there's no machlokes and that the Chachamim would agree that you could play music as part of the karbonos? So the Gemara says not necessarily. It could be that there is a machlokes there as well, and that Rabbi Yosef said that there's a machlokes about the regular carbon music could still be true. It could be that there's really a machlokes in both situations. It doesn't necessarily reject both halves of what Rav Yosef has said. Now, why does this Brisa then only discuss the playing of music on with Simchas Beis Sheva? That's to show how far Rabbi Yehuda goes that he even allows that. So the Gemara says the problem with this is in our Mishnah. If you look in our Mishnah, it discussed the Simchas Beis Sheva music, and it said that it does not push away Shabbos. So it's clearly the Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold that way. And it says Zehu. Our Mishnah says Zehu. This is the music that doesn't push away Shabbos and Yantif, which clearly implies that the other music that goes together with Karbonos does push away Shabbos and Yantif. So then you clearly see that the Rabbanan would not argue. The Rabbanan would say that the music with Karbonos does push away Shabbos and Yantif, and therefore that we have completely rejected Rav Yosef's opinion in both halves. Now the Gemara says, what is the source of the machlokes, the two opinions as to whether the playing of music counts as avoda or not? The Gemara says the machlokes is over two psukim in a Divrei Hayamim. One says, "Yom Chizkiyo lahalo sa'ola lahamizbeach." Chizkiyo said to bring the korban ola on the mizbeach. Ovei seichel ha'ola. And when they started the work of the Ola, Heichal Shir Hashem, they started the music, and it describes it as follows: V'achatzotzor, so there was the singing and the trumpets, Aidei Klei David Melech Yisrael, with the musical instruments of David, king of Israel. So you see that we're describing the avoda of the shira as involving clay shir, as involving musical instruments. Now the other opinion is a different pasuk which says that the trumpeters and the singers played together. Now Rashi explains trumpets don't count as musical instruments. Trumpets had a different function. And there is no other musical instruments mentioned here, so you see that it's not an essential part. Music from instruments is not an essential part of the shira. So what does he do with the pasuk from before, which clearly mentioned musical instruments? And where it says that, he just holds that that's not part of the shira. That's not part of the avodah. That was just something that was added. It was a nice accompaniment, but it was not essential. Now, what is the opinion that says that the instruments were essential? What does he do with this pasuk here that doesn't mention the instruments? So the Gemara says that it's read as follows: the singers are like the trumpeters, just like the trumpeters are with a kli, the singers also went with a kli. So the singing, which refers, the word singing doesn't mean only with a voice as it does in English, it means music, and it refers to with a kli as well. We now begin the Mishnah, which describes the Simchas Beis Sheva specifically and a lot of things that happened there, and the Gemara will follow discussing Alexandria. So the Mishnah says, whoever did not see the Simcha, the celebration of the Simchas Beis Sheva, never saw real Simcha, never saw real happiness in his life. How did it work? The end of the first day of Sukkot, the Kohanim and Levim went down out of the main Azara to go out to draw the water, the procedure in which they draw the water, and they went down into the Ezras Nashim, the big courtyard in the Azara. It's outside the main Azara where the Mizbeach was, to make a special celebration. And it says that they were metaking a tikkun gadol, they fixed a great fixing. The Gemara will describe what that is. But in the Ezras Nashim, which is where the main simcha was, they had golden candelabras that were set up there. Each one was a gold pole with 4 golden bowls set in the top, one in each direction, and those held oil. Now, how do they fill them up? So they brought a ladder for each of the bowls. That's 4 for each candelabra, and 4 young Kohanim went up, holding pitchers containing 120 lugin of oil, which they poured each 120 lug into one of the bowls. Now, they made wicks out of the worn-out clothing of the Kohanim, the Bigdei Asra, the pants and the avnetim, the belts, and they tore them and they made wicks, and this they used to light these lights. Now, the light was so high, it was so tall because of the height of the Har Bayis and because of the candelabras on top of the poles that it lit the entire Yerushalayim. Now, the Chasidim Anshe Maisa, the Tzadikim, would dance in front of the Kohanim and Leviim by juggling torches, flaming torches in their hands, and they sang songs and praises to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, the Leviim, with their harps, lyres, cymbals, trumpets, and other many musical instruments, stood on the steps that went down from the Ezras Yisrael to the Ezras Nashim. Let's just get the picture straight in our head. We have the Mizbeach and the Heichal in the large Azara, the large main courtyard. That's really Ezras Kohanim. Moving from there eastward, you have a strip which is Ezras Yisrael. And moving from there eastward, you have steps going down to the Ezras Nashim, which was a large courtyard. And then you can continue moving eastward and go out into the Har Bayis. So you have the Kohanim and Leviim coming down, and you had people standing on the steps. The Mishnah describes that there were 15 steps that were keneged, corresponding to the 15 Shir Hamalos found in Tehillim. And the Leviim stood there and they sang songs and played music during this time only, not during the Mizbeach. The Carbon Shira, there they had a platform near the Mizbeach where they stood and they sang. Now, 2 Kohanim stood by the gate at the top of the steps from the Ezras Yisrael to the Ezras Nashim, and they were holding trumpets, and the crier called out, as we've seen in Masechas Shkolim. He called out and he gave the signal, and they blew tekiah through a tekiah. When they reached the 10th step, descending the 15, when they got to the 10th step, the Gemara will explain the next step what that was about. When they reached the 10th step, they blew again tekiah through a tekiah. When they reached the floor of the Ezras Nashim, they again blew tekiah through a tekiah. And then they would continue stretching out this through a tekiah, until they got all the way to the gate leading out of Har Bayis, out to the east. And this is again on the way to drawing the water. And they reached the gate, they turned their faces westward, back towards the Heichal, and they bowed towards the Heichal, and they said, our forefathers who were in this place were Ovdei Avodah Zarah, and they bowed towards the sun and stuck out their backs towards the Heichal. We are Anu L'ka ve'einenu L'ka. We have our eyes to Hashem, and we are to Hashem. And Rabbi Yehuda said they repeated it a second time and said, Anu L'ka u'L'ka einenu. We are to Hashem, and to Hashem are our eyes. Now the Gemara quotes a Brisa which begins with a very similar phrase to this Mishnah. The Brisa says, whoever did not see Simchas Beis Sheva in his life never saw Simcha in his life. And it continues and says, whoever did not see Yerushalayim in its splendor never saw a beautiful city. And whoever did not see the Beis HaMikdash when it was built never saw a beautiful building in his life. Now, which Beis HaMikdash are we referring to? The 3 options are Beis HaMikdash number 1, the first Beis HaMikdash, the second Beis HaMikdash before it was remodeled by Herod, and the second Beis HaMikdash after it was remodeled by Herod. So the Gemara says that it's got to be referring to the second Beis HaMikdash after it was remodeled by Herod. That was the most beautiful one of the 3, and How was it made? So Rava said it was made with stones of green and white marble. Others say it was made with green, blue, and white marble, and it was made in waves, so that every alternate row of stones was stuck further in, and every alternate one was stuck further out. That way there was space for cement behind the stones, because the way Herod liked to build, he didn't put cement between the stones, he held them in with cement behind them. Therefore he created it in this way, so you have the pockets. Now he wanted to plate the entire walls with gold, but the Chachamim said, leave it. It's more beautiful like this because it looks like the swirling waves of the sea. Now the Gemara quotes another brisa that talks about Alexandria of Mitzrayim. So the brisa again opens with a similar phrase, and it says, whoever did not see the Dioplaston of Alexandria never saw the beauty of Klal Yisrael, the kavod of Klal Yisrael in his life. What was the Dioplaston? So it's a Greek word which either refers to the rows of the benches that they had in the main shul in Alexandria, or refers to the columns, the rows of columns that they had holding up the shul because of its largest. Now the Brisa continues to describe it at length. It says that the main shul there was like a large basilica, that is like courtrooms had with columns holding it up. One row of benches within another row of benches, and the shul was so big that it held twice 600,000. It held 1.2 million people, twice the number of people who left Mitzrayim. Now there were 71 chairs there made out of gold, one for each of the members of the Sanhedrin, because they made their own type of Sanhedrin, and each chair was made of so much gold. It was 21 kikar of gold, which is a tremendous amount of gold itself. Now in the middle of the shul was a bima, a raised platform, and there the Gabbai used to stand with a flag in his hand. When it came time to answer Amen, nobody could hear, not everyone could hear the chazan because the shul was so big. He would wave the flag, everybody could see the flag, and then they would answer Amen. Now they did not sit just spread around. People sat in groups based on their profession. The goldsmiths sat together, the silversmiths sat together, the blacksmiths sat together, the coppersmiths sat together, and the weavers sat together. When somebody came in, they didn't have a job, he would go sit where his craftsmen were, and then when people were looking to hire, they could go hire him from there because they knew that's where he was. Now what happened in the end? So the Gemara says they were destroyed by Alexander the Great. Now the Rishonim here question how that could be. Alexander the Great was one of the founders of Alexandria, so he wouldn't be around to destroy this community. So the Gemara changes, there are some Rishonim who change it to Trajan, who was an emperor who was associated with a lot of fighting with Klal Yisrael many years later. Now why were they destroyed? So the Gemara says because they violated the mitzvah of they're not supposed to go back to Mitzrayim, and they went and came back to Mitzrayim. What was the story? Alexander, or whoever it was, came into the shul there, and he found Klal Yisrael reading the Teichacha and saying the pasuk of Yis Hashem Alacha Goy Merachak, Hashem will bring you a nation from far away like the eagle flies. So Alexander said, usually this trip takes me 10 days, but it's such a strong wind that it came in only 5 days, therefore this is a fulfillment of that pasuk, and therefore it's my responsibility to go and kill them all, and that's what he did. Okay, now the Gemara goes back to analyzing the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said that they made a tikkun gadol, a great fixing. What was that great fixing? The Gemara says they made a balcony. They made that they were pieces protruding from the wall, and they put planks on top of them so that women could sit on top on an upper level and not down below. The Gemara brings a brisa describing it, and that the way they had it arranged initially was that the women were inside the Ezras Nashim and the men were outside. But the problem is the men came in, and therefore they mixed together and it caused problems. So therefore decided to put the men on the inside and the women on the outside, but still they were winking and staring at each other, and that wasn't good either. So therefore they built a balcony, and that way they were separated. The Gemara says, how are they allowed to build a balcony? Don't we know that Hashem gave clear instructions to David HaMelech how to build the Beis HaMikdash, and everything had to follow those instructions explicitly. It says that David said to Shlomo Yaakov b'chsav miyad Hashem alai hiskil. Hashem taught me everything that I'm supposed to do. So Gemara says the reason they were allowed to do this was they found a pasuk that indicated that this is what you're supposed to do. What's the pasuk? The pasuk is describing the funeral for Mashiach ben Yosef. Before the ultimate Mashiach ben David arrives, he'll be preceded by Mashiach ben Yosef, who will be killed in the Mechama of Gog and Magog. And the pasuk in Zechariah describes his funeral, and it says, "V'saf the hearts mishpachas levad, mishpachas beis David levad, u'neshem levad." The women and the men will be separate. So you see, if at a funeral, which is a sad time, you have to keep the men and women separate, certainly at a time of simcha, you definitely have to keep the men and women separate. There's a Yetzer Hara. At other times, there's far less of a Yetzer.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.